Chapter 6. Monsieur Hager and Mrs. Robinson. At first, everything went well. Monsieur Hager wrote to me often. He was pleased with my daughters, he said. They were good pupils. But life at home in Haworth was hard. My curate died, and Aunt Branwell became very ill. Emily and Charlotte came home to see her, but she was dead before they arrived. She was a good woman, Elizabeth Branwell. She kept my home for more than 20 years, and she taught my daughters everything she knew. But she never liked Haworth. I am sure of that. She said it was a cold, miserable place. I hope that God has found somewhere warm and comfortable for her now. But how could I live without her? My eyes were now very bad, and I could not see to read. And our servant Tabby was older than I was. Anne could not help me. She was a governess for the Robinson family, and now Branwell had a job there too, teaching their young son. So Charlotte went back to Brussels alone, this time as a teacher in Monsieur Hager's school. Emily stayed at home to cook and clean for me. She did not like Brussels, she said. She was happy to do the housework and live at home with Tabby and me. She was a strange, quiet girl, Emily. She was the tallest of the girls, and in some ways she was as strong as a man. She loved to walk by herself on the wild, lonely moors, with her dog keeper running by her side. Sometimes I saw her there, singing or talking quietly to herself, and I thought perhaps she could see the people in her secret world of Gondal and was talking to them. I know that she spent a lot of time writing alone in her room, and when Anne was at home, she and Emily often talked and wrote about the world of Gondal together. There were sometimes dangerous people near Haworth, so I always had a gun in the house. Before my eyes were bad, I taught Emily to shoot. She loved that. Sometimes I used to practice shooting in the garden while she was making bread in the kitchen. I shot first, then I called Emily. She came out, cleaned her hands, picked up the gun, shot, and went back in to finish the bread. She was much better at shooting than I was, but by 1844 my eyes were too bad for shooting. Emily cooked, cleaned the house, played the piano, and almost every day she went for long walks on the moors with her dog, Keeper. She loved that dog, but she could be very hard with him too. We did not let him go upstairs, but one day Tabby found him on my bed. Emily was very angry. Her face was white and hard. Keeper was a big, strong dog, but she pulled him downstairs and hit him again and again until the dog was nearly blind. Then she gently washed his cuts herself. He never went upstairs again. Charlotte was another year in Brussels. When she came home, she was quiet and sad. Sometimes she wrote long letters in French to Monsieur Hager, but no letters came from him. But this was a time of hope, too. The girls wrote advertisements for their new school and sent them to newspapers and to everybody they knew. It was exciting. They were good advertisements, and we waited for the first children to come. We waited a long time, and Charlotte wrote more advertisements. No children came. Every day Charlotte and Emily waited for a letter from the postman, or for a parent to come to see them. Every day they became more miserable. Anne left her job with the Robinsons and came home to Haworth. A month later, Branwell also came home for a holiday. And then one morning, early, there was a knock on the door. Charlotte ran to open it. But it was not a parent. It was a letter for her brother Branwell. He went upstairs with it, smiling. A few minutes later, there was a terrible scream. We ran upstairs to Branwell's room. He lay on his bed, screaming, with a white face and wild, dark eyes. The letter was in his hand. "Branwell, what is it? What's the matter?" I asked. He tore his hair with his hands. "I'm ill," he said. "I'm cold. Oh, what does it matter? She doesn't care. I can't see her. Oh, it's all finished now, finished forever. I'll die without her. Here, Branwell, drink this." Emily brought him a cup of hot milk, but his hand was shaking and he nearly dropped it. Charlotte put her hand on his head. "He's hot, Papa. He's burning," she said. "You must go to bed at once, Branwell." He went to bed, and he lay there, sometimes sleeping, sometimes shouting and crying. I tried to talk to him, but I couldn't understand what he said. Then, later, Anne explained. She told us a terrible story. I was so angry. I nearly broke a chair with my hands as I listened. My son Branwell, Anne said, was in love with Mrs. Robinson, the rich mother of his pupil. For months this lady had spoken kindly to Branwell, walked with him in the garden, talked to him alone in the evenings. He thought she would marry him when her husband died. And then there were other things that Anne did not want to speak about. The letter was from Mr. Robinson. He was often ill, Anne told us. But his children knew about Branwell and their mother, and the servants knew too, I think. Perhaps Mr. Robinson had learnt something from them, or perhaps that woman, I cannot call her a wife, had told him everything. Only one thing was certain. In his letter, Mr. Robinson had ordered Branwell never to return to his house or to speak to any of his family again. My face was hot, and my hands were shaking. I tried to talk to Branwell about it, but it was impossible. "I love her, Papa," he shouted. "You don't understand. How can you? You've never seen her." "I don't want to see her, my son," I said. "I understand that she is a bad, evil woman. I hope that God will punish her and—" "Don't say that, Papa," he screamed. "You are talking about the woman I love. She will call me back. I will see her again." "I hope you never see her again, my son," I said. "You must forget her. Branwell, listen to me." But he did not listen. He ran out of the house. He did not come back until the evening, and then he was drunk. He did not listen that day, or the next day, or any day. He began to drink laudanum as well. I thought he would kill himself. So I think Charlotte was pleased that no parents came. No school could have a man like Branwell in it. Chapter 7. Currer, Ellis, and Acton Bell. At about this time, in 1845, I was almost blind. I had a new curate to do my work, Arthur Nichols, a young man of 28. He came from Northern Ireland like myself. He was a good, hard worker. I spoke in the church on Sundays, but Arthur Nichols did the rest of my work. Branwell became worse and worse. Mr. Robinson died in 1846, but Mrs. Robinson didn't marry Branwell. Oh no, she was a cold, wicked woman. She sent my son Branwell away, and later married a rich old man. and so Branwell spent more and more time drinking and taking laudanum and walking alone on the moors. When you are blind, you listen to things very carefully. I used to sit alone in my room and listen to the sounds of the wind outside the house. The wind talks and whispers and sings. It has many voices. I listened to the sounds of the clock on the stairs, and the wood in the fire, and the footsteps and voices of the girls walking round the house. They talked a lot to each other, and sometimes I could hear what they said, even when they were in another room. Anne had had a poem published in a magazine, and one day I heard a conversation between Charlotte and Emily. Charlotte had found something that Emily had written and was talking to her about it. "But they're wonderful, Emily," Charlotte said. "They're much better than mine or Anne's." "They're not for people to read," Emily said. "They're part of the Gondel story. Nobody would understand them except me and Anne." I realized that they were talking about some poems of Emily's. I knew that Emily and Anne wrote a lot about the country of Gondel, but I didn't know much about it. Emily kept all her papers locked in her desk. Charlotte was arguing with her. "Emily, listen to me. These are fine poems. I think we should put some of them in a book together with mine and Anne's and try to publish it. People should read them." "No!" Emily shouted. Then her dog Keeper began to bark, and I didn't hear any more. But I think they talked about this again several times. I often heard voices arguing, and usually they never argued about their writing. I wanted to tell them not to do it. I had published several small books myself, but I always lost money. I had to pay the publisher to print the books, and not many people bought them. It's an easy way to lose money. But I was too ill, so I said nothing. I learnt, many years later, that they paid over £30 to have a book of poems printed, and that it sold 2 copies. I am not surprised that they didn't tell me about it. We had very little money in our house. I began to feel that there was something wrong with my head, as well as my eyes. Several times the postman brought an old packet to our house, which was addressed to a man called Currer Bell. I told him that no Currer Bell lived in Haworth, and sent him away. But then, a month or 2 later, he came back again, with the same old packet. In the summer of 1846, Charlotte took me to see an eye doctor in Manchester. We stayed in rooms in the town. The doctor decided to operate on my eyes, and the next morning we got up early. I was afraid. Could I hold my head still while the doctor cut into my eyes with a knife? Perhaps the pain would be too terrible. Perhaps I would move, or stand up, or... Charlotte held my hand. As we left our rooms, we met a postman. "Good morning, miss," he said. "There's a packet here for Currer Bell." "Oh, thank you." Charlotte sounded sad, but she took the packet and put it in her room. She did not open it. Then we walked to the eye doctor's. The pain was terrible, but it was over in 15 minutes, and I didn't move. Afterwards, I had to lie on a bed in a dark room. We couldn't go home for a month. A nurse came sometimes, but Charlotte stayed with me all day. I asked her once about the packet. She said, "Oh, it's for a friend of mine, Papa. It had a letter for me in it. I have posted it away again now." I didn't understand, but I didn't ask again. I lay quietly on my bed most of the day, and Charlotte sat in the next room writing. She wrote very fast for many hours and never put her pen down once. She seemed quiet, but strangely happy. I was happy too. The doctor had helped. I could see again. It was wonderful. The colors, the shapes of everything were beautiful. When we came back to Haworth, I could see everything clearly at last. Our home, the church, the graveyard, the moors, the faces of my Emily and Anne. And Branwell. Branwell's face looked terrible. White, thin, with big dark eyes and untidy hair. His clothes were dirty, he smelt. His hands shook. All the time he was either shouting or crying. And always, every day, he asked me for money. I let him sleep in my room at night, and he kept me awake for hours talking about Mrs. Robinson. I remembered his paintings, his stories, his happy childish laughter. My fine, clever son had become a drunken animal. The winter of 1846 was terribly cold. The wind blew snow around the house and over the gravestones. A lot of children died in the village. Anne was ill. Branwell was worse. We lit fires in all the rooms, but there was ice inside the windows in the mornings. I spent most of my time with Branwell, so I didn't think very much about the girls. And then, one afternoon, Charlotte came into my room. I was sitting here, in this same chair, beside the fire. She had a book in her hand, and that strange, happy look on her face. "Papa," she said, "I've been writing a book." I smiled. "Have you, my dear?" I thought she had written another little book about Angria. "Yes, and I want you to read it." "Oh, I'm afraid it will hurt my eyes too much." My eyes were much better, but the tiny writing in the Angria books was too small for me. "Oh, no," she said. "It's not in my handwriting. It is printed." She held out the book in her hand. "My dear, think how much it will cost. You will almost certainly lose money because no one will buy it. No one knows your name." "I don't think so, Father. I didn't pay to get it printed, you know. The publishers paid me. Listen to what people say about it in these magazines." She sat down and read to me from some of the most famous magazines in England. There were long articles in them about a book called Jane Eyre by Currer Bell. They were kind articles. Most of the magazine writers liked the book. "This Currer Bell, then?" I asked. "Is it you?" Charlotte laughed. "Yes, Papa. It's a man's name, with the same first letters. C.B. Charlotte Bronte Currer Bell." She gave me the book and went out. I began to read. I think I read for 2 hours, but it seemed like 10 minutes. It was a wonderful, beautiful book, the story of a little girl called Jane Eyre. Her parents are dead, so she lives with an unkind aunt and her children. Then Jane goes away to a school called Lowood. This school is a terrible place, and it is very like the school at Cowan Bridge. Jane Eyre's best friend, Helen Burns, falls ill at the school and dies. This Helen is just like my own little Maria. When I read about her death, my eyes filled with tears. But it was a beautiful book, too. I did not want to put it down. At 5 o'clock, I got up and went into the sitting room. My 3 daughters sat there waiting for me. Their eyes were very bright. I still had tears in my eyes, but I had a big smile on my face, too. I held up Jane Eyre in my hand and said, "Girls, do you know Charlotte has written a book? And it is more than good, you know. It is very, very fine indeed." Chapter 8. The best days and the worst days Emily and Anne did know, of course. They had known about Charlotte's book for a long time. Jane Eyre was not the first book that Charlotte had sent to a publisher. Over a year ago, she had written another book, The Professor, and sent it to one publisher after another. Each publisher had sent it back in a packet addressed to Currer Bell. And then Charlotte had sent it in the same old packet to another publisher, and then another, and got it back again. "Why didn't you change the paper on the packet, my dear?" I asked. Charlotte smiled. "I didn't think of it, Papa. The worst day was when we were in Manchester, going to the eye doctor. Do you remember? The packet came back then. That was the day before I started writing Jane Eyre." "Do you mean that you started writing Jane Eyre while I was lying in that dark room in Manchester?" "That's right, Papa." "But that's only 6 months ago, and here is the book in my hand." "Yes, Papa. The book was printed a month after I sent it to the publisher." "My dear, they decided very quickly that they liked it then." "I think they did, Papa. After all, it is a good book, isn't it?" She smiled at me. I don't think I have ever seen her so happy. She is a very small person, Charlotte, and not a beautiful woman. But when she smiles like that, her face shines like a fine painting. My wife, Maria, used to look like that sometimes when I first met her. I took her hand in mine. "It is a very good book, my dear. I cannot tell you how proud I am." She touched my hand. "Thank you, Papa. But you must not be proud of me alone, you know. Anne and Emily." "Oh, no, Charlotte, please," Emily said. But Charlotte did not stop. "Anne and Emily have written books, too. Books just as good as mine. And their books will soon be published as well. Let me introduce you, Papa. These young ladies are not your daughters. They are Acton Bell and Ellis Bell, brothers of the famous writer Currer Bell." Emily's face was bright red, but Anne and Charlotte started laughing. I was very surprised. "All 3 of you," I said. But why do you use these strange names?" "Because people are stupid, Papa," Anne said. "No one thinks women can write good books, so we have used men's names instead. And now they say that Currer Bell is a writer who understands women very well." She laughed again. My dears. I held out my hands to them and kissed each of them in turn. I don't know what to say. I am so pleased for you all. You have made your old papa happy today. Something in Emily's face stopped me. "Emily, you will let me read your book, won't you?" She thought for a moment. "Yes, Papa, of course. But it's very different from Charlotte's. I'm not sure you'll like it." "You yourself are very different from Charlotte, my dear, but I love you both. You must show me the book as soon as it comes. And you too, Anne." I read both their books that winter. They were very different. Anne's book, Agnes Grey, was the story of an unhappy governess. As I read it, I was sad to think how miserable Anne had been, in a big house away from home, where no one understood her. It was a good book, but it was harder to read than Jane Eyre. Emily's book was called Wuthering Heights. It was a terrible, frightening, wonderful story. There is love in it, and hate, and fear, and a man called Heathcliff, who is strong and cruel like the devil himself. I read it late one night when the wind was screaming round the house, blowing snow against all the windows. And sometimes I was afraid. When I got up to go to bed, I saw Emily sitting quietly by the fire. She was stroking her big dog, Keeper, with one hand, and drawing a picture with the other. She looked like a quiet, gentle young woman, I thought. Tall, pretty, and also there was something different about her. Something very strange and very strong. There was something in her that was stronger than any of her sisters, even Charlotte. Something stronger than even me, or her brother Branwell. Much stronger than Branwell. All that year, Branwell was very ill. He spent more and more time drinking. He slept most of the day, and was awake half of the night. His face was white. His hands shook when he tried to write. His sisters didn't tell him about their books, or show him the new ones that they were writing. They were afraid that he would be unhappy about their success, because he had wanted to be a writer himself. He made life hard for all of us. In September 1848, he became very ill. He coughed all day and all night. He began to talk of death and asked us to pray with him. While we stood together, praying, he began to cough again. He fell to the ground. Emily and I put our arms round him, but he couldn't get up. There was blood on his mouth and on Emily's dress. When he stopped coughing, it was because he had stopped breathing. My only son was dead. We buried him in the church beside his mother and little sisters. It was a cold, rainy afternoon. There were dead wet leaves in the graveyard, and the wind blew rain into our faces. I came back into the house soon afterwards, but Emily walked for an hour or two in the rain with her dog, Keeper. When she came back into the house, her dress was wet through. Several days later, Emily became ill. Her face was hot. She couldn't eat. She kept moving round the house. It was difficult for her to breathe, and it took her a long time to climb the stairs. Charlotte felt her heart. It was beating 115 times a minute. "Let me call a doctor, Emily," Charlotte said, but Emily refused. "If he comes, I won't talk to him." "Then go to bed and rest, please. I can light a fire in your room and bring you milk and read to you if you like." "You need rest, sister." "I do not," said Emily slowly. She had to breathe hard between each word, and her face was as white as Branwell's had been. "My body doesn't matter now. I don't care about it. I'll live as I always have." And so, every day, she got up at 7 o'clock, dressed herself, and stayed downstairs until 10 at night. She ate little or nothing and coughed for hours. Sometimes she coughed blood. She never went out of the house, but one day Charlotte brought some heather from the moors for her to look at. Emily was lying on the black sofa in the sitting room. Her dog, Keeper, lay on the floor in front of her. "Look, Emily," Charlotte said. "I've found some purple heather for you. There are still 1 or 2 flowers left on the moor." "Where?" Emily asked. "Here, look." Charlotte held out the small, bright purple flower. Emily turned and looked at Charlotte, but I don't think she could see the heather. Her eyes were too bad. Charlotte put it in Emily's hands, but after a moment Emily dropped it on the floor. At last she said, "Charlotte, I will see the doctor now. If he comes." Then she closed her eyes. Emily was so thin, and her white skin looked like paper. I knew it was too late, but I said to Anne, "Quick, put on your coat and fetch him now." We did not have long to wait. The doctor came half an hour later to tell us what we already knew. Emily, my daughter, was dead. 1848 was a year of funerals. I buried many children from the village that year. There was a lot of sadness in Haworth. As I came out of the church with the dead flowers from Emily's grave, I saw 3 other families walk past me. They had come to visit the graves of their own dead children. The people understood that their children were with God, but no one could explain that to Emily's dog, Keeper. He followed us to her funeral, and for weeks afterwards, he lay outside her bedroom and howled. Chapter 9. Arthur Nieholz. That was not the end of my sadness. Anne, too, became ill. She could not breathe. She coughed. Her face was white. But she was more sensible than Emily. She took all her medicines and did everything the doctor said. It didn't help much. In the spring, she said she wanted to go to the sea, to a warmer place. The doctors told her to wait. I thought she would die before she went. At last, in May, Charlotte went away with her. They went to York first, where they visited a wonderful church, York Minster. "If men can make something as beautiful as this," Anne whispered, "what is God's real home like?" Charlotte told me this in a letter she sent from Scarborough, a town by the sea on the northeast coast. On 26th May, Anne rode a donkey on the beach, the letter said. She was very happy, Papa. Afterwards, we went to church and then sat and watched the sea for a long time. On the 28th, she was too ill to go out. She died quietly at 2:00 in the afternoon. She will be buried in a graveyard near the sea. Anne was the baby of the family, the youngest and prettiest of them all. Before she died, she wrote another book, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, about a woman who left her cruel husband. She was proud of it, and so was I. She was 29 years old. "I don't want to die, Papa," she said. "I have too many ideas in my head, too many books to write." When Charlotte came home, the dogs barked happily. Perhaps they thought Anne and Emily and Branwell were coming home too. I don't know. But it was only Charlotte, the smallest of all my children. Not the prettiest, not the strongest, not the strangest. God had taken all those for himself. He had left me with the one who would become the most famous, and the one who nearly had a child. Charlotte wrote 2 more books. Shirley, about a strong, brave woman like her sister Emily, and Villette, about love between a teacher and a pupil. But Jane Eyre was her most famous book. Everyone in England talked about it. Everyone wanted to read it. Charlotte went to London and met many famous writers. I was very pleased. I loved to hear about the people and places that she saw. But she always came back to Haworth. She didn't like to be with famous people very long, and this quiet place was her home. In 1852, just before Christmas, a terrible thing happened. I heard some of it from my room. My curate, Arthur Nichols, opened the door to Charlotte's sitting room and stood there. His face was white, and he was shaking. "Yes, Mr. Nichols," Charlotte said. "Do you want to come in?" "No, Miss Charlotte. That is, yes. I mean, I have something important to say to you." I heard his voice stop for a moment, and then he went on. "I have always felt strongly about you, Miss Charlotte, and my feelings are stronger, much stronger than you know. And well, the fact is, Miss Charlotte, that I am asking you to be my wife." There was a long silence. I heard every word, and I felt cold and angry. Mr. Nichols was a good curate, but that was all. I paid him £100 a year to help me with my work, but he had no place in my house or in my daughter's bed. I stood up and opened my door. "Mr. Nichols." He turned and looked at me. I could see Charlotte behind him. "You will leave this house at once, Mr. Nichols. I am very, very angry. You must not speak to my daughter again, ever. Do you understand me?" The stupid man was shaking and almost crying. I thought he was ill. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Then he turned and went out of the door. Mr. Nichols stayed in his own house for 3 days. He refused to eat, the stupid man, and he sent me some angry letters. But Charlotte wrote to him to say that she would not marry him. Then Mr. Nichols said he would leave Haworth and go to Australia. On his last day in church, he had to give people bread to eat. But when he held out the bread to Charlotte, he could not do it, because he was shaking and crying so much. Afterwards, the people of Haworth gave him a gold watch. He cried about that too. I thought it was all finished, but I was wrong. I think he wrote to Charlotte, and she wrote back. In April of 1854, he came back to Haworth. Charlotte brought him into my room. I looked at him, but I said nothing. I was not pleased. "Papa," Charlotte said, "Mr. Nichols and I have something to say to you. I did not like that. Mr. Nichols and I, it did not sound good to me." "I am busy," I said. "I have a lot of work." Charlotte smiled. "That's because you don't have a good curate, Papa. When Mr. Nichols was here, your life was easy." "Perhaps," I said. "But he was going to Australia," I thought. "Why haven't you gone, sir?" Mr. Nichols spoke for the first time. He looked very tall and proud, I thought. "There are 2 reasons, sir," he said. "First, because I have decided not to go to Australia. And also—" He stopped and looked down at Charlotte. She smiled up at him, and I felt my blood run cold. "And also, because your daughter Charlotte and I would like to be married. We have come to ask you to agree." I don't remember what I said next. I think there were a lot of unkind words between us, and some tears. But in the end, I agreed. I agreed because Charlotte wanted it, not because of Arthur Nichols. In June that year, they were married in my church. I did not go. I could not give Charlotte away to that man. But he came back here to be my curate, and he and Charlotte lived in this house with me. He is still here now. Perhaps he will read this. If he does, he will know that he was right, and I was wrong. Mr. Nichols was, after all, a good husband for Charlotte. I understood after a while that he honestly loved her, and he could make her happy. She began to smile and laugh again. Her eyes shone. She sang sometimes as she worked. Our house became a home again. She went with him to see his family in Ireland and traveled to the far west of that country. Mr. Nichols did most of my church work for me. Charlotte began a new book, Emma, she called it. And one day in December 1854, she came into my room, smiling. I could see that she was excited. "What is it, my dear? Have you finished your book?" "No, not yet, Papa. But I have something wonderful to tell you." "What do you think?" "I don't know, my dear. If it's not your book, then—" "I told Arthur yesterday. I am going to have a child." I did not say anything. Her hand was on the table, and I put my hand on it gently. It was wonderful news. I remembered when my own wife, Maria, had told me this, and how this house had been full of the laughter of little voices and the noise of running feet. Charlotte and I sat like that for a long time, remembering. It did not happen. At Christmas, she fell ill, and in the New Year she was worse. She felt sick all the time because of the baby, and she ate nothing. She lay in bed all day, hot and coughing. Arthur Nichols cared for her wonderfully. I think he often stayed awake all night. But it did not help. On 31st March 1855, the last of my 6 children died. It was early in the morning. Arthur Nichols was sitting by her bed, and I was standing by the door. She was asleep with her hand in his. Her face was very thin and pale. She opened her eyes and saw him. Then she coughed, and I saw fear in her face. "Oh, God," she whispered. "I am not going to die, am I? Please don't take me away from Arthur now. We have been so happy." Those were the last words she ever said. A little while later, I walked slowly out of the house. As I went into the graveyard, the church bell began to ring. It was ringing to tell Haworth and all the world that Charlotte Bronte was dead. Chapter 10, Maria. And so now I have written it. It is 3 o'clock in the morning. The house is very quiet, and the wind has stopped. I can hear the sound of the wood burning in the fire and the clock on the stairs. Somewhere upstairs, Arthur Nichols is sleeping quietly. I know that Charlotte's friend, Mrs. Gaskell, has nearly finished her book about Charlotte. Perhaps I will show her what I have written. Perhaps. But I don't think so. I wrote to her before and answered her questions, and that is enough. She is a writer. She can write her own book. I will keep this book in my desk, for myself, and perhaps for Arthur Nichols. There is no need for other people to read it. My daughter Charlotte is famous already, and when Mrs. Gaskell has, I wish my wife Maria could read Charlotte's books, and Emily's and Anne's. Perhaps she can. We had some fine children, didn't we, Maria? I wonder if she can hear me. It is a fine night, now that the wind has stopped. There is a bright moon, and the sky is full of stars. I think I will go outside and walk through the graveyard to the church and talk to Maria there.